Welcome to Crisis and Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
It's good to be back.
Today, we're opening a file that I think rests right at the very center of American political mythology. We are going back to the 1960s. We're talking about the Great Society. And inevitably, we have to talk about the man who looms over that entire decade like a colossus, Lyndon Johnson.
LBJ, of course, the master of the Senate, the chaotic force of nature.
Exactly. And before we get into our source material, which is Julian E. Zelizer's really incredible book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, I want to set the scene with the version of the story we all kind of have in our heads.
The Hollywood version.
The Hollywood version, yeah. You picture this 6'4" Texan. He's sweaty, he's aggressive, he's in a suit that's maybe slightly too big.
Right.
And he's got a senator pinned against a wall in the cloakroom. He's leaning in nose to nose, that famous Johnson treatment. And the narrative basically is that LBJ was a wizard. He's this singular force who just willed modern America into existence through intimidation, charm, and sheer volume.
And it's the ultimate great man theory of history, isn't it?
It really is.
We love that story because it's simple. It tells us that history changes because one person was strong enough or loud enough to change it. It appeals to our desire for heroes and villains.
But our mission today is to dismantle that story, or at the very least, to look at the wiring under the floorboards. Because Zelizer's argument, and the whole focus of this deep dive, is that LBJ wasn't a wizard. He was a mechanic.
A mechanic. I like that.
A very, very good mechanic, yes. But a mechanic who got lucky enough to walk into the garage at the exact moment the tools, the parts, and the crew were all perfectly aligned.
Precisely. If you take away the specific legislative math of 1964 and 1965, LBJ is just a tall man yelling at a wall. The Great Society wasn't a triumph of personality. It was a triumph of institutional design. It was this brief, fragile 2-year window where the machinery of the U.S. Congress, which you have to understand is usually designed to kill bills, was rewired to pass them.
So what we're really doing today is a systems analysis of the American government. We're looking at the inputs, the outputs, and all the friction in the gears.
We are. And to understand how the system worked in the mid-60s, you first have to understand how it was broken for the previous 40 years. We need to talk about what Zelizer calls the architecture of stagnation.
I love that phrase, the architecture of stagnation. Because I think people today look at gridlock in Washington and think, oh, politics is so broken right now, it's never been this bad. But Zelizer points out that Congress in the 1940s and 50s was a graveyard.
A literal graveyard for legislation. And this is the first big correction we need to make to our mental model. We tend to think of politics today as Democrats versus Republicans.
Right. Two teams, different colored jerseys, fighting for control.
Red team, blue team. Simple. But in the mid-20th century, those labels were incredibly misleading. The real power struggle wasn't Democrat versus Republican.
It was what?
It was the conservative coalition versus, well, everyone else.
Break that coalition down for me. Who are we talking about here?
Okay, so you had the Republicans, largely from the Midwest, who were fiscal conservatives. They didn't want to spend money.
Stop the spending crap?
That's them. But they were allied with the Southern Democrats, and these were men from the old Confederacy segregationists, deeply conservative, and just fiercely protective of states' rights.
And states' rights was basically code for something else.
It was code for maintaining the racial hierarchy in the South. Absolutely.
So, wait. You have a Democratic president like JFK or Truman, and he technically has a Democratic majority in Congress, but half his own party is actually playing for the other team.
Exactly. The Southern Democrats would vote with the Republicans to block anything that smelled like federal intervention. Civil rights, education, healthcare, anything.
So they didn't just use votes.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
They weaponized the rules of Congress itself. They turned the institution into a fortress against change.
Okay, let's talk about those weapons, because this is where the systems part gets really interesting. It wasn't just that they had the votes, it's that they held all the keys to the building.
And the most powerful weapon, the absolute foundation of the stagnation, was the seniority system.
Right.
In the mid-20th century, you didn't become a committee chairman because you were smart, or loyal to the president, or because you had good ideas. You became chairman solely based on how long you had been there.
Tenure. Just pure survival.
Pure tenure. And just think about the political geography for a second. If you were a Democrat from, say, Chicago or New York, you have rough elections.
Sure, you got primaries, general elections.
Right. You have Republicans challenging you. Turnover is high. You might serve 2 terms, maybe 3, and then you're out.
But if you're a Democrat in rural Mississippi in 1950,
You have zero competition. The South was a one-party state, so these Southern segregationists would get elected in 1930 and just stay there until they died.
and over the decades, they accrued massive seniority.
Which meant, by the time the 1960s rolled around, Southern conservatives held the chairmanship of almost every single meaningful committee in Congress.
So they captured all the choke points.
They owned them. The Judiciary Committee, controlled by a Southerner. Ways and Means, which handles taxes and Social Security, controlled by a Southerner.
And the deadliest of them all,
The House Rules Committee.
Zelizer spends so much time on this. The Rules Committee, it sounds incredibly boring, like a procedural footnote.
It does.
But he describes it as the traffic cop of the entire government.
It's more like the border guard. In the House of Representatives, you can't just bring a bill to the floor and vote on it. It has to go through the Rules Committee first. They decide if it gets debated, how long it gets debated, and what amendments are allowed.
So they have absolute power over the flow of legislation.
Total power. And the man running this committee was Judge Howard Smith of Virginia.
He feels like the main antagonist of the first part of this story.
In a structural sense, absolutely. Howard Smith was an ardent segregationist and a fiscal hawk. And he had this brilliant, cynical realization that he didn't even need to vote no on a bill to kill it.
You just got to do nothing.
Nothing. The pocket veto, he would just disappear, literally. When a civil rights bill came up or an education bill, Howard Smith would leave D.C. and go to his dairy farm in Virginia.
His dairy farm.
His dairy farm. He wouldn't answer the phone. He'd claim a barn burned down or a cow was sick. No joke.
Sorry, Mr. President, I can't schedule a hearing on your flagship legislation today. I have to go milk a cow.
That was effectively it, yes. And because the rules required the chairman to call the meeting, the bill just sat there. It gathered dust. It died of neglect. This was the deadlocked democracy that JFK inherited.
It sounds incredibly frustrating. I mean, for a new president with a big agenda.
Kennedy spent 3 years just smashing his head against Howard Smith's dairy farm. He couldn't pass Medicare. He couldn't pass civil rights. He couldn't pass federal aid for schools. The system was designed to stall.
And it was working perfectly.
It was. The founders designed a system of checks and balances, right? But the conservative coalition had turned those checks into impenetrable walls.
And that's just the House. What about the Senate?
Over in the Senate, you had the filibuster. At that time, you needed a 2/3 vote to break it. That's 67 votes. The Southern Bloc was organized enough that they could almost always prevent that.
So they could just talk a bill to death.
Forever. And then there was the secrecy.
No C-SPAN.
No cameras. No transparency whatsoever. Most of the markups, where they actually write the text of the bill, happen behind closed doors. So a committee chairman could kill a bill in a secret vote, and his constituents would never really know who did it or why.
It's an architecture of unaccountability.
Perfectly put. So that's the landscape in November 1963. Kennedy is assassinated. LBJ takes the oath of office on Air Force One. And now a new variable enters the system.
A very big, very loud variable.
Right. But we have to be careful here. The myth says LBJ came in and just started bullying people and suddenly the doors swung open.
But Zelizer argues that's not quite it.
No. He argues that LBJ's real skill was something he calls incentive logic. He didn't just intimidate. He traded.
What's the distinction there? Does it sound similar?
Intimidation is, vote for this or I'll hurt you. Incentive logic is, I know what you need more than anything else in the world, and I'm the only guy who can give it to you.
Oh.
LBJ was a creature of the Senate. He had been the majority leader. He knew the internal wiring better than anyone alive. He knew that Senator X needed a dam in his district to win re-election. He knew Senator Y wanted a federal judgeship for his brother-in-law.
He had the ledger. He knew everyone's price.
He knew the price of every man in the room, and he was willing to pay it. The Johnson treatment wasn't just yelling, it was the conversion of that information into leverage. This wasn't magic. It was a complex asset exchange.
And the tax cut of 1964 is a perfect case study of this before the big landslide.
It really is. It shows him working within the old broken system.
Right. So this was a Kennedy priority. He wanted to cut taxes to stimulate the economy, but it was just stuck.
Stuck tight. And the main obstacle was Senator Harry Byrd, another Virginian, another conservative icon.
Chairman of the Senate Finance Committee.
The gatekeeper for any tax bill.
Yeah.
And Harry Byrd was obsessed, and I mean truly obsessed with the federal budget deficit. He was a fiscal Puritan.
Okay.
He told LBJ, point blank, I will not let this tax cut out of my committee unless the federal budget comes in under $100 billion.
Which, for context, is basically a rounding error in today's government.
A rounding error. But back then, $100 billion was this huge psychological barrier, and the budget was naturally drifting up towards, say, $102 or $103 billion.
So Byrd was drawing a line in the sand.
A very firm line. Now, the old LBJ, the mythical one, might have yelled at him. He could have threatened him. But that would not work on Harry Byrd. Byrd was completely safe in his seat in Virginia. He was an institution.
So what does LBJ do instead?
He invites Byrd to the White House.
Yeah.
And he doesn't yell. He woos him. He gives him the grand tour. He shows him the private residence, talks about history. He treats him like royalty. He builds this incredible intimacy.
And then they have lunch.
Lunch. Vanilla ice cream, apparently. LBJ leans in real close and says, Harry, if I can get that budget under $100 billion, will you release the bill?
He makes it a bargain.
A simple quid pro quo. And Byrd says yes. If you do your part, I'll do mine.
So now LBJ has to perform a magic trick. He has to make billions of dollars disappear to hit a completely arbitrary target.
And this is where the systems approach just shines. LBJ didn't actually cut the government in a meaningful structural way. He couldn't.
So what did he do?
He used accounting trickery. It was brilliant. He ordered his budget director to go through the books and sell off government assets, spare parts, surplus land, whatever they could find.
Like a national garage sale to pay the rent?
That's a perfect analogy, and they could book that revenue immediately. Then they shifted payment dates for defense contractors. They literally moved payments from December to January, so they would fall into the next fiscal year.
He's cooking the books.
It's creative compliance. They managed to get the number down to $97.9 billion. It was a completely artificial number, but it didn't matter.
Because it satisfied the structural requirement of the gatekeeper.
Precisely. LBJ brought the ledger to Harry Byrd. Byrd looked at the number, nodded, released the bill, and the tax cut passed.
And the economy boomed.
It boomed. And that gave LBJ all this momentum and political capital he needed going into the election. But, and this is probably the most important point of our entire deep dive, the tax cut was just a warm-up. It was LBJ playing the old game perfectly.
Okay.
The real pivot point, the moment the entire universe shifted, was November 1964.
The election.
If you want to understand the Great Society, forget the speeches. Forget the Johnson treatment. Look at the election returns.
LBJ wins in a historic landslide.
A landslide, 61% of the popular vote. He absolutely crushes Barry Goldwater. But the presidency isn't the story. The story is the coattails.
The people he dragged across the finish line with him.
Yes. Democrats picked up 37 seats in the House. They solidified their majority in the Senate. But it wasn't just the number of Democrats. It was the kind of Democrats.
Explain that, because as you said earlier, Democrat didn't always mean liberal.
Not at all. For years, the Democratic Party was held hostage by the Southern conservatives. But in 1964, the wave brought in 71 new Democrats from the North, the Midwest, and the West.
And these weren't the old guard.
No, these were liberals. They were young. They supported civil rights. They supported Medicare. They literally ran on the platform of the Great Society.
So suddenly the conservative coalition we talked about, that alliance of Republicans and Southerners, they do the math. They realized
we don't have the votes anymore. The liberal bloc finally had the raw numerical superiority to outvote the obstructionists. The gridlock wasn't broken by LBJ's personality. It was broken by the American electorate sending a new squad to Washington.
The math changed.
The math changed everything.
Okay, so now we have the fabulous 89th Congress. They arrive in D.C. in January 1965. They have the numbers, but they still have a problem. The rules are still the same.
Yes.
Howard Smith is still the chairman of the Rules Committee. The seniority system is technically still in place.
And this is where the 89th Congress gets revolutionary. And this is why this specific Congress is so unique in American history. They didn't just start introducing bills. They opened the hood of the car and rewired the engine.
They changed the rules of engagement.
Immediately. First, they targeted Howard Smith. They reinstated something called the 21-day rule.
And how did that work?
It's a bypass mechanism, a release valve, it said. If the Rules Committee sits on a bill for 21 days and does nothing,
goes to the dairy farm.
Right. Then the Speaker of the House has the authority to unilaterally pull that bill out of the committee and put it on the floor for a vote.
That strips the gatekeeper of his power. He can't use the pocket veto anymore.
Exactly. His main weapon was neutralized. He could delay things for 3 weeks, but he couldn't kill him anymore. It broke the bottleneck. It forced the flow of legislation.
That's a massive shift in the power dynamics of the whole institution.
And then they went after the seniority system itself. There were two Southern Democrats, John Bell Williams and Albert Watson, who had publicly supported the Republican Barry Goldwater during the election.
Which, historically, Southern Democrats did all the time without any consequence, right? They'd support the conservative regardless of party.
All the time. But this time, the Democratic caucus said, no more. They held a vote and stripped those two men of their seniority. They took away their committee standing and threw them to the bottom of the ladder.
Wow. That must have sent a shockwave through the building.
It was an earthquake. It was a clear signal that party loyalty and support for the president's agenda was now worth more than tenure.
It changed the incentive structure.
For every other Southerner, they realized, if I block LBJ too hard, I might lose my chair. I might lose my power.
And they also changed the committee ratios.
Yes. They stacked the committees. They changed the ratio of Democrats to Republicans on key committees like Ways and Means to reflect their new supermajority. This ensured that even if a few Southerners voted with Republicans, the liberals still had the votes to move bills out.
So they've rigged the machine to work for them instead of against them. They have the numbers, they have the new rules. Now they need to pass the bills. Let's look at the first big test, education.
The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESE. This is a fascinating case of how to solve a puzzle that had been considered unsolvable for 20 years.
Why was it unsolvable? I mean, who doesn't like schools?
Everyone likes their schools. But the federal government couldn't give money to schools because of what was called the religious issue.
Separation of church and state.
Correct. The powerful teachers' unions and the Protestant voting bloc were adamantly opposed to any federal tax dollars going to Catholic parochial schools. They saw it as unconstitutional.
But the Catholics were a huge part of the Democratic base, especially in the North.
Exactly. The Catholic lobby and the Catholic bishops were just as adamant. They said, if you pass a bill that gives money to public schools but leaves our kids out, we will kill that bill.
So it was a trap, a catch-22.
A perfect trap. Include the Catholics, you lose the Protestants. Exclude the Catholics, you lose the Catholics. Every president since Truman had failed to solve it.
So how did LBJ and his team finally crack it?
They didn't solve it with a big speech. They solved it with a clever, lawyerly reframe, a structural workaround called the child benefit theory.
The child benefit theory. That sounds like something a tax attorney made up at 2 in the morning.
It basically is. They argued, we are not giving this money to the Catholic Church or the Catholic school. We are giving this money to the child.
And the child just happens to be sitting in a classroom in a Catholic school.
Right. The money was specifically earmarked for things like textbooks, library resources, and remedial reading programs. The logic was, a textbook is a benefit to the student, regardless of where they sit. A reading tutor helps the child, not the Pope.
That is a very, very thin distinction.
It's a legal fiction, but it was enough. It gave the Protestants a fig leaf to say, we aren't funding religion, and it gave the Catholics the resources they needed. It broke the deadlock.
But passing it required more than just the theory. It required what Zelizer calls ruthless efficiency.
It was a legislative blitzkrieg. The subcommittee chair, a guy named Carl Perkins, looked at the new rules, he looked at the new numbers, and he just decided to bulldoze the opposition.
What did that look like in practice?
He held hearings day and night. He barely gave the Republicans time to read the text of the bill. He packed the witness list with supporters and ran them through one after another.
No time for debate.
Almost none. And then they did something tactically brilliant with the Senate.
This is the part that really stands out from a systems perspective.
It's amazing. Usually the House passes a version, the Senate passes a different version, and then they have to form a conference committee to merge the two.
Right, and that merged bill has to be voted on again by both houses.
Which gives opponents, like Howard Smith, a second chance to kill it. Another bite at the apple.
So what did they do?
LBJ and the House leaders convinced the Senate to pass the House version of the education bill word for word.
They didn't change a comma.
Not a comma. By passing an identical bill, they skipped the conference committee entirely. They denied the opposition that second chance. The bill went straight from the Senate floor to LBJ's desk.
That is legislative mastery. It wasn't about hearts and minds. It was about navigating the procedural maze to avoid the Minotaur.
Exactly.
That brings us to the big one. The crown jewel of the Great Society. Medicare.
Healthcare, the third rail of American politics, even then.
The American Medical Association, the AMA, had been fighting this since the days of Harry Truman. They famously called it socialized medicine.
Right. And they had a very powerful ally in Congress, Wilbur Mills.
Chairman of Ways and Means, we mentioned him earlier.
Wilbur Mills was the wall that healthcare legislation had crashed into for a decade. He was a conservative Arkansas Democrat, very cautious, fiscally prudent, and he hated the idea of a huge new program that couldn't pay for itself. He was arguably the most powerful man in Congress when it came to the economy.
So why did he change his mind in 1965? Did he have a sudden burst of compassion? Did LBJ finally get to him?
No, he had a sudden burst of self-preservation. This is about institutional survival. Mills looked at the election returns of 1964. He saw those 71 new liberals. He saw the new rules.
And he could read the writing on the wall.
He realized, if I don't write this bill, they're going to write it without me. And they might even bypass my committee entirely. He didn't want to become irrelevant.
He wanted to be the one holding the pen.
So he went from being the chief obstructionist to the chief architect. And what he designed is fascinating from a systems perspective. It's called the three-layer cake.
Walk us through the layers of this cake.
Okay, so there were three competing ideas on the table at the time. The Democrats wanted what we now call Medicare Part A, hospital insurance for seniors, funded by payroll taxes. That was the standard liberal goal.
That's layer one.
Right. The Republicans, in an attempt to offer a counterproposal and kill the Democratic plan, suggested a voluntary insurance program to cover doctors' bills, not just hospitals.
Layer two.
Yep. They thought this would confuse the issue, water it down. And then there was a third, smaller proposal to expand welfare coverage for the truly indigent, the poor who weren't necessarily old.
Layer three.
So Wilbur Mills, in this stroke of absolute political genius, sits up in the hearing and says, why don't we do all three?
He called their bluff. He took all their pieces and put them on his board.
He combined them into a behemoth. Medicare Part A for hospitals, Medicare Part B for doctors, and Medicaid for the poor. He created a system far larger and more comprehensive than anything LBJ had even asked for.
Why? Why go so big?
Yeah. He basically said, if we're going to do this, let's make it so comprehensive that the Republicans have nothing left to complain about. He co-opted all their ideas.
But here's the key question on the systems level. How did they stop the doctors from revolting? The AMA hated this. They spent millions fighting it.
This is the genius of system entrenchment. They bought them off.
Plain and simple.
Plain and simple. The bill was designed to co-opt the opposition. It included a provision that the government would pay hospitals and doctors their customary, prevailing, and reasonable charges.
Which means...
In other words, bill us whatever you want and the government will write the check.
My God.
It unleashed a fire hose of federal money into the medical industry. Suddenly, doctors and hospitals weren't opponents of big government. They were the primary beneficiaries of it.
So you create a stakeholder class.
You turn the opposition into a dependent. Once those federal checks started clearing, the AMA's opposition it evaporated. It's the golden handcuffs.
And that's why Medicare is still here today.
It's why it's so hard to change. It wasn't just a moral victory for seniors. It was a fundamental economic restructuring of the U.S. healthcare system that made the providers dependent on the federal government.
I want to pivot now to the other pillar of the Great Society, civil rights. We have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Both are massive, obviously, but from a systems perspective, they worked in very different ways. The 1964 Act, the one that desegregated lunch counters and hotels, that was the one moment where the Johnson treatment really mattered in the classic sense. They had to break a filibuster in the Senate.
And to do that, they needed a Republican.
They absolutely did. They needed 67 votes. The Southern Democrats were never going to vote for it. So LBJ and Hubert Humphrey had to court Everett Dirksen, the Republican minority leader. That was old school horse trading, appealing to Dirksen's vanity, his desire to be a statesman. It was a legislative brawl.
But the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that's a different beast. That's a systems fix.
It is the ultimate systems fix. And to understand its brilliance, you have to look at why all the previous voting rights laws had failed.
What was the problem with them?
The Civil Rights Act of 1957, the Act of 1960, even parts of the 64 Act, they all relied on litigation.
Meaning, if a county in Alabama wouldn't let you vote, you had to sue them.
You had to hire a lawyer, file a complaint, and go before a judge. And who was the judge?
A local segregationist.
Almost always. The legal system was slow, it was expensive, and it was hostile. It was designed to exhaust the plaintiff. You could win a case after years of fighting, and the county would just change the literacy test slightly, and you'd have to start the whole process all over again.
It was a game of whack-a-mole.
A rigged game of whack-a-mole. So the VRA of 1965 changed the mechanism entirely. It shifted enforcement from the judiciary to the administrative state.
From judges to bureaucrats.
It's a crucial distinction. They created automatic triggers, the law said. If a state has a history of using a literacy test and has less than 50% voter turnout, boom, the federal government automatically takes over. No lawsuit needed.
The trap snaps shut.
Instantly. And once triggered, two things happen. First, pre-clearance. Those states could not change a single voting law, couldn't move a polling place an inch, couldn't redraw a district line without getting permission from the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. first.
They lost their sovereignty over their own election.
Completely.
Yeah.
And second, federal examiners. The government sent people with clipboards down to the South. They set up tables in post offices and courthouses. They bypassed the local sheriff and the local registrar. If you wanted to vote, you signed the federal form and you were registered, period.
And the results were?
Instantaneous, explosive. In Mississippi, black voter registration went from something like 6% to nearly 60% in just a few years. It proves that you can't just declare a right. You have to design a delivery mechanism that bypasses the local bottlenecks. You have to federalize the machinery itself.
So we have this incredible run, 1964, 1965, the fabulous 89th. It seems like they are passing a major bill almost every week. It feels like this momentum will just go on forever. And then the music stops.
The window slams shut just as fast as it opened.
Why? What broke the machine?
This is what Zelizer calls system distortion. The feedback loops turned negative, and the single biggest distortion, without a doubt, was Vietnam.
The war.
The war acted like a parasite on the Great Society. First, there was the budget. Wars are incredibly expensive. The whole guns and butter dilemma kicked in.
Right.
The conservative fiscal hawks, who had been silenced by the landslide, suddenly had a voice again. They started saying, we can't afford a war in Asia and a war on poverty at home. You have to choose.
Scarcity returned to the political calculation.
And secondly, there was political capital. As the war dragged on and became deeply unpopular, LBJ lost his aura of invincibility. He wasn't the master of the universe anymore. He was the guy stuck in a quagmire. He spent all his time and energy managing the war, not managing Congress.
But Zelizer argues it wasn't just the war. The liberal coalition itself started to fracture from within.
It did, and it fractured over housing. This is a critical and often overlooked nuance.
The 1966 Civil Rights Act.
Right. The early civil rights bills were about the South. They were about desegregating lunch counters in Birmingham and voting booths in Selma. Northern liberals loved those bills.
It allowed them to feel morally superior to the backward South without it costing them anything.
Exactly. It didn't change their daily lives. But the 1966 bill aimed at fair housing.
Which meant preventing discrimination in the sale and rental of homes in Chicago and Detroit and New York.
Suddenly, the issue wasn't over there. It was in the Northern liberals' own backyards, their own neighborhoods, their own property values.
And the not in my backyard effect kicked in.
Hard. The white ethnic working class in the North, a core part of the Democratic coalition that had voted for LBJ, they revolted. They did not want integration in their neighborhoods. And the liberal consensus shattered almost overnight. The Republicans saw a massive opening.
And at the exact same time, you have the riots.
What it's? The Watts riots in Los Angeles in 1965, and then others, completely changed the national mood. The images on television went from peaceful marchers singing, "We shall overcome," to cities burning.
And the narrative shifted.
It shifted from civil rights to law and order.
Which the Republicans capitalized on.
They did.
Yeah.
The 1966 midterm elections were a bloodbath for the Democrats. The Republicans swept back into power. They defeated many of those 71 freshman liberals who had made the Great Society possible in the first place. The numbers flipped back.
The conservative coalition was back in business.
They regained their working majority. And just like that, the gridlock returned. The window was open for exactly 2 years, January 1965 to January 1967. After that, LBJ couldn't pass anything meaningful. The machine had reset to its default setting, stagnation.
So, if we look back on it, was the Great Society just a glitch?
Yeah.
A 24-month error in the system?
In terms of the volume of legislation, yes, it was an anomaly. We haven't seen anything like it since. But, and it's the final crucial insight from Zelizer, the program survived.
The persistence. This is the key to understanding the long-term impact.
Yes. Richard Nixon wins in 1968. He's a Republican. He campaigned against big government. He appealed to the silent majority who were tired of the chaos and the spending.
You would expect him to come in and just dismantle the Great Society?
Tear it down brick by brick. That was the expectation. But he didn't.
He actually expanded it.
In many ways, yes. Zelizer calls this the Nixon paradox.
So why? What stopped him?
Two main systemic reasons. First, path dependency. Once you give a popular benefit to the middle class or a key industry, you cannot take it away. Imagine a politician trying to repeal Medicare in 1970.
Or today.
It's political suicide. The systems had created their own powerful constituencies. The elderly, the doctors, the hospitals, they were all hooked on the federal flow of money. The golden handcuffs were locked tight. You remove the program, you crash the entire healthcare system.
It's too integrated to remove.
Yeah.
And the second reason,
Nixon was a pragmatist. He was a very shrewd politician. He realized that while voters claimed to hate the government in the abstract, they loved the specific things the government did for them.
right, they hate welfare, but they love their Social Security check.
Precisely. They wanted clean air. They wanted workplace safety. They wanted their Social Security checks to keep up with inflation.
And Nixon's the one who indexed Social Security to inflation, isn't he?
He was. Before that, Congress had to vote to raise it every few years. Nixon made it automatic. He also signed the bill creating the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. The regulatory state actually grew under Nixon.
Which proves the point.
It proves that once a system is installed and integrated into the economy, it becomes part of the bedrock. It becomes structurally and politically costly to remove it.
So let's bring it all back to crisis and perception. We've gone through the mechanics, the brief window, and the persistence. What is the big, critical thing being misperceived in the common narratives about the Great Society?
We misperceive the narrative because we look for heroes and villains. We focus on the great man, LBJ, or the movement, MLK, and we ignore the legislative mechanic. We ignore the machine itself.
And what's the structural layer that's typically ignored?
It's the specific, anomalous alignment of the 89th Congress. That two-year window, 1965 to 1966, was an anomaly, was not the norm of American politics. The norm is gridlock. That brief period of hyperproductivity was the exception.
So surface-level interpretations, the ones about LBJ's personality, fail to explain why the programs persisted.
They fail completely.
Yeah.
Because they look at ideology rather than constituency formation. Systems analysis reviews that once the government becomes a provider of essential services to powerful groups, like the elderly or the medical industry, the political cost of dismantling that system outweighs the ideological desire to shrink it.
So how does this kind of systems analysis change what becomes visible to us?
It makes us stop waiting for a savior. We look at the dysfunction in modern politics and we think, if we just had a leader like LBJ, he would fix it.
We need a tough guy to go in there and knock some heads together.
But the lesson of Zelizer's book is that a great man without the math is powerless. LBJ was a genius, yes, but he was a genius who was surfing a tsunami. The tsunami was the 1964 election returns.
The system is the protagonist of the story.
The system is the protagonist, and it's also the antagonist. The default setting of the U.S. Congress is gridlock. That is how the founders designed it. It is supposed to be hard to pass laws. The Great Society was a perfect storm of executive focus, a legislative supermajority, and external social pressure that briefly suspended the laws of political gravity.
It's a humbling thought, really. The transformative change doesn't come from charisma. It comes from alignment.
It comes from the mechanics. It comes from the committee ratios, the rule books, and the sheer number of warm bodies in the seats. If you want to change the world, don't just look for a hero, look at the math.
And look at the incentives.
Always, always look at the incentives.
We're going to wrap it up there. This has been a deep dive into the fierce urgency of now, a masterclass in how the sausage actually gets made.
It's a vital corrective to the history we think we know.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.